All right, I think we will get started. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming for our annual Valdai update. I'm Angela Stent. I'm director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. I have Professor Andrew Kuchins with us, who is a senior fellow at CERES, and we were both at the Valdai discussions last week. So I'm going to start by talking about everything but President Putin. So I'm going to talk about the other panels and some of the other things we heard. Professor Kuchins will talk about President Putin's appearance, and then there are some things obviously that we won't have covered, and we'll welcome your questions. So this was the 15th Valdai. It's the 15th I've attended. And it was, for the past 5 years, the Valdai has been held in Krasnaya Polyana, which is a village above Sochi, and we stay in the hotel that was built for the G8 that never was. Finished in 2014, so it's a beautiful hotel, and it has 8 different houses to it, which was supposed to house the 8 delegations. And just a small note on climate change. So this is the 5th time we've been in Krasnaya Polyana. It's the first time there was no snow on the mountains. Mountains were pristine without snow, and it was very warm, but it was beautiful. So the theme for this year, and of course you can find a lot of this if you go on the Valdai website. The theme for this year was Russia, Agenda for the 21st Century. And we were rather positive about this because last year everything but Russia was discussed at Valdai because President Putin had not yet declared his candidacy for the presidential election. And so we talked about things like artificial intelligence and climate change. But this year the theme was Russia, Agenda for the 21st Century, although in the end I think there was less about Russia than some of us might have wanted, but at least more than last year. Remember, this was first founded as a way of having foreign experts go to Russia and learn more about Russia. So a report was written. Again, the report is on the website for you to read. And the title of the report was Living in a Crumbling World. And so this was a pretty gloomy report written by 4 or 5 of the young people who work for the Valdai Foundation. The old world order is gone. Again, this is a theme we hear quite often. The old ways of business no longer are useful, and there is no sustainable model of world order. And it harked back to November 1918. And it said we are in a position as they were 100 years ago at the end of World War I, when everything was sort of crushed and empires were dissolving, empires fell. And you can imagine which empire they were thinking about that they claim is now in bad shape. The report discussed populism, and then it also said that the United Nations was no longer adequate for the new world order. This was an idea that was contradicted by some of the speakers at the conference, but this was the report. So, no solutions and a grim outlook. So the first panel we had discussed this report. And you won't be surprised to hear that the Russian participants all agreed that this was the end of the US alliance system, that the world order was crumbling because the US and its alliance system was disappearing. However, the American speaker, who is Professor William Wolford from Dartmouth College, said, no, not so fast, and what's happening now may in the end lead to a stronger alliance between the US and the Europeans and its Asian allies. This is obviously something one can debate. And the other interesting thing on the panel was Madame Fu Ying. She is she's the foreign affairs spokesman, right, of the Chinese parliament. Very eloquent woman, former ambassador to Britain. And she was quite clear in her remarks that Russia and China did not have an alliance. They had a strategic partnership, but this was not an alliance, and it wasn't moving towards one. And she repeated that to me privately. I'm sure she did to some of the other people that she talked to. One of the most interesting statistics from the panel that I have to read to you, if it's true, I haven't checked it out, 47% of Russian young men want to go into the security services, but 42% of them also want to study abroad. In the West. So I don't know how you...
Foreign intelligence services.
Maybe that's it. So this is, you can put those together. Another couple of just remarks. There were fewer U.S. participants this year, and there were fewer U.S. panelists the relationship with China was much more stressed. So there were more Chinese, and we did have a Chinese Politburo member address us on the last day, again in a speech which talked about the need for greater harmony and new world order, but also talked without mentioning names about countries that were behaving very dangerously and were disrupting the world order with things like trade wars. So we definitely heard from a senior Chinese official. Let me give you another, a few more sort of details of some of the other panels. So we did have a couple of panels on Russian culture and national identity. Natalia Solzhenitsyn was one of the speakers on the culture panel. And she talked a lot about conservative values, Russia's conservative values. This is the new identity. And then she was asked, what are conservative values? And she thought for a moment, and she answered the Besmyetny Polk, the Eternal Regiment. On May 9th, when they celebrate Victory Day, now the parade that they have where everyone carries pictures of their ancestors, relatives, whatever, who perished or fought in World War II. And so she talked a lot about honoring the dead and about World War II. And for those of you here, and I'm looking at Professor David Fox, but everyone else who are historians, the emphasis on World War II and its importance. So that was very much there. Then we were treated to an interesting talk by a Deputy Defense Minister, Fomin, and you, I believe, took photos of his PowerPoint presentation. Do we know whether that's on the website yet? We don't know. Anyway, I didn't, but we had
put it up on ours.
We put it up on ours, right. So we had a very interesting PowerPoint presentation from the Deputy Defense Minister. He accused the West and the United States of non-gentlemanlike behavior, whereby the U.S. is seeking to dominate the world. Now, he stressed, we had a lot of discussion about Syria, obviously, and he, like Lavrov and President Putin, all stressed that Russia and Iran are in Syria legitimately. They were invited to be there. But the United States and its allies are there illegitimately because they were not invited to go in by the Assad government. And people said that in many different ways. He was very critical, Minister Fomin, of U.S. policy, of the U.S. making the world more dangerous. The one positive note were the negotiations on the DPRK, and that was something that was pretty consistent at Valdai, which was saying because the United States is now engaging with North Korea, because the South Koreans are, this is a positive step, and it will make the world a less dangerous place. And then finally, and again, this I'm sure will be on the photos you took, we had some pictures on this PowerPoint of some pretty impressive new weapons, reminding one of Putin's speech at the beginning of March when he showed all those new wonder weapons that Russia has. Now, that was followed by another panel which really had to do with culture and identity. And there, an interesting takeaway was a discussion with Metropolitan Tikhon of Pskov, who is alleged to be quite close to President Putin. So one of the themes at this conference, and also at a previous conference that I attended the weekend before Valdai in Moscow, was, of course, the autocephaly decision of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the Patriarch of Constantinople's, decision to grant them that. So this is obviously very controversial and highly criticized in Russia. Tikhon explained he went back to 1686 when the Moscow Patriarchate was given the order to rule Kiev, the Kiev Patriarchate from Moscow. And for 300 years, he said, we in Moscow have had the right to rule the Kiev Patriarchate. Now suddenly Constantinople, recognized the autocephaly of Ukraine. And as for those of you who follow this, you know that there's the subtext here is that the Greek Orthodox Church, is powerful in the United States, and this is basically the U.S. is responsible partly for what's happened here. This was very much stressed. Then there was a big discussion, or a discussion then of what this meant. And so there's one Ukrainian who comes to Valdai who's quite pro-Russian. And he raised the question of what happens to property, what happens to things like the Pecheskaya Lavra, the beautiful church and the tombs, the catacombs, I guess you call them, in Kiev. Who does that belong to? And so we didn't get it. Well, I mean, the answer was it belongs to Moscow, and we're not going to let this go. And then we heard not so much from Metropolitan Tikhon himself, but from some of the other speakers, for instance, Vyacheslav Nikonov, that blood might be spilt over this. And so there were echoes in other conversations that Russia is not going to accept this decision by Constantinople lightly, and that action may be taken in the future. So, unspecified, which of course just, reinforces the understanding one has that this is partly about religion, but it's a lot about property and about power and about history, the power of history and identity. We had a panel on the Middle East, and that was one of the panels where there was no American speaker, which was unusual, because every other Middle East panel we've had at Valdai, you've always had an American speaker. But instead, we had Vitaly Naumkin, who of course is a great Russian specialist on the Middle East. We had an Iranian speaker, a Turkish speaker, and we had former Afghan President Hamid Karzai. And I might say last year he was on the stage with President Putin, and he was very critical of America. This year he was somehow much more conciliatory in what he said. Everyone has to work together in Afghanistan, and we will find a solution. So his tone had changed. I'm not quite sure what the reason for that was. Again, we had a rather upbeat discussion on that panel about what's happening in Syria. They're regulating the situation in Idlib. They have these humanitarian corridors. Soon the war will be over, and the terrorists have been defeated. But then the other thing that the Russians stressed particularly is the need for the West to come in and help with the reconstruction of Syria. And if you're following this, you know that the US and the Europeans are rather more hesitant about doing that. But we did have an upbeat picture. And the Iranian speaker, who's a former Deputy Foreign Minister, Mr. Sajidpour, said that Iran is the only country in the region that's a security provider for the whole region of the Middle East. I think we could quibble about that, but that's certainly how it was presented. And then they had a sort of more theoretical discussion about a new order in the Middle East, with some people saying, well, there hasn't been an order in the Middle East since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago. Okay, now we come to the hero Cheesemaker. So one of the more colorful participants in this year's Valdai was one Alexei Rota, and he is the head of the Russian Cheesemakers Association, a patriotic farmer who was galvanized by the anti-Maidan demonstrations in Russia. And he was the only one attending Valdai in a flannel shirt, jeans, and suspenders. He didn't observe the business casual dress code.
A peasant shirt.
A
modish peasant shirt.
But it wasn't a kind of mujik shirt.
No.
It was a kind of Western shirt.
Yeah.
Anyway, what was his message to us? His message to us was, the villages were dying in Russia. He went back to the 1990s and how you had all this rural decline, villages are dying, and then came the sanctions against Europe. So the best thing that's happened to Russia are the sanctions that the Russians imposed on the Europeans after sanctions were imposed on them after Crimea, because that has stimulated Russian domestic food production. So now he claims he's producing cheeses that not only people eat in Russia, but he exports them to Europe. He claimed that Italians are eating his cheeses. Maybe it's Russian mascarpone now. Anyway, we'll see. He said, I have built up this very successful farming enterprise, and I didn't have to pay one bribe, no bribes at all. Everything's working very well. The enterprise is growing at 300% per year, and 50% of his workers are refugees from the Donbas region. So he talked about what it was like having these, refugee workers from the Donbas and how hard they work and what a success this is. And he appeared both on a panel, and then I guess he got to ask or to talk to President Putin, who approvingly, congratulated him on the great feats of being the hero cheesemaker. Two of the other people who I thought were very interesting on another panel were actually civil society activists. So we did have two civil society activists who were there, but obviously in areas which the government sanctions. One of them was a very impressive woman who founded and runs a palliative care center in Moscow for adults, and is trying now to open one for a pediatric one too, but had to fight hard to get the property and to be able to do this. And so when we had the session with President Putin, she actually stood up and sort of, as one used to do with the czars, I guess, stood up and said, we need more resources, and these are the problems I'm having with the Moscow municipality. And President Putin listened and said that he would look into this. And the other impressive woman runs a senior citizen, or an NGO for senior citizens and people with disabilities called Starist et Radist. So, old age is joy.
Can't wait.
You can't wait, right? So there, as I say, there were a couple of those. Now, the final panel that we listened to featured well-known pundits, Sergei Karaganov, Vyacheslav Nikonov, Andrei Kortunov, and then Alexander Orlov, who's a former Russian ambassador to Paris. He's a diplomat. And that was really hard-hitting, tough. So Nikonov claimed that Russia should leave all organizations that are Russia-bashing. So he said Russia should leave the G8. Well, of course, it's already left the G8. It was kicked out of it. And Russia should leave the Council of Europe. So there is a debate going on. I mean, Russia's been in the Council of Europe since the early 1990s and has stayed there, but we don't know. And then Karaganov, who agreed with him, said Russia should leave the OSCE. The OSCE is a good-for-nothing organization, he said. It's another Russia-bashing organization. And then they both accused the United States of a range of sins. I would say Andrei Kortunov spoke at a different level. He was at a more abstract level, and he didn't get into these kinds of discussions. It was a discussion that in fact had more to do with world order. And then they argued, similarly to Mr. Sirota for the EU, anti-EU sanctions, they both argued that the American sanctions are pushing Russia much closer toward China. We did have a panel where we had Maxim Oreshkin, the economics minister, and we had Boris Titov, who's the head of the Union of Industrialists. Is that what he's the head of, Atlas? Or
No.
No, he's not anymore.
Small
Small business, sorry, the small businessman. Anyway, Titov was critical of of the current economic policy of the Russian government. Oreshkin gave a glowing view of it, and most of what was conveyed to us in the discussion on economics was Russia's doing fine. It's weathered the worst of the sanctions. Sanctions are in fact, making us rationalize more what we're doing, and sanctions are driving Russia and China closer together. So we had that message from several people, including Karaganov and Nikonov. And then the final speaker was Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He, of course, went back and talked about the legitimacy of the annexation of Crimea, and he had a new analogy this time. This is one I haven't heard. I thought I'd read all of the explanations, and that is likening it to the Falklands War. As I was telling my students yesterday, probably not too many people here know what the Falklands War was, but it was a war between Britain and Argentina in 1982, and the Falklands in the end declared their independence. But sort of going back to that, he then accused the United States of blackmailing not only Russia but everyone, so it was a pretty tough speech. And then when he got to the question of the current negotiations, he claimed that Ambassador Kurt Volker, who of course has been meeting with Mr. Surkov, he hasn't met him for some time, but he has in the past, that he had changed the rules for what people were supposed to discuss. In other words, he claimed that Ambassador Volker was talking about things that were outside of the Minsk agreement. Obviously, the U.S. is not a signatory to that, the Minsk II agreement, and that he himself was making it impossible, the U.S., to move forward on Ukraine because it had changed the terms of the discussion. So now the other thing about Mr. Lavrov, as was true with President Putin, not a negative word about President Trump. So yes, America was criticized greatly. President Trump was not, and Lavrov said that President Trump's officials are sabotaging his policy toward Russia. So this is something we can debate. So I would say the bottom line is, from these other panels, was Russia's economic recovery, they talked about, its self-sufficiency, its poor relations with the West, its improving relations with China, its leading role in the Middle East, and its return to other areas of the world from which it withdrew after 1992. The world is crumbling. The United States' importance and influence is shrinking. and Russia's and China's influence and importance are raising. But the possibility of major armed conflict was sort of alluded to at various times. So I'll pass it to you.
Well, that's a really comprehensive.
But you may have come out with other
Summary.
things. We
No.
all hear and see what we want from these things. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll talk about the only thing that we didn't discuss was the presentation by Tigran Sargsyan.
Oh, that's true.
Eurasian Economic
Eurasian
Union.
Union. Yeah.
But we can come to that if somebody wants
Sure.
to talk about it in the discussion, because it was kind of interesting. So I'll talk about kind of my perspective on Mr. Putin's discussion with us. Just for the context, of course, when he met with us, this was the day after the Kerch College shooting tragedy, and so there was an air of, I think, somberness with the president, and in the room a bit more generally. So he made his. This is the 15th meeting of the Valdai Discussion Club, so it was kind of a jubilee of some sorts. He made his usual appearance on the final day, last Thursday, 1 week ago. And in contrast to some of the recent Valdai meetings, especially 2014, 2015, definitely 2008, Mr. Putin evinced no visible anger towards the United States or the West. His perspective was different. The target of his irritation was the moderator of the panel, Fyodor Lukyanov. And here they took a different tack on the format. You know, in the first 9 years that we met, it was a much smaller group, 35, 40 of us, and Mr. Putin would meet with us by himself and simply, he might say, make a few perfunctory opening remarks and then simply take questions for 2.5 to 4 hours. Then, for the 10th anniversary, they expanded the Valdai Discussion Club, moved it, in 2013 it didn't move to Sochi, 2014 it moved to Sochi, but they had Putin appearing on a panel, usually with other retired government officials, and they're trying to, you know, have him, people closer to his echelon, but that never really worked very well. Just to give you an idea, last year on the panel, there was former Afghan president, as Angela mentioned, Hamid Karzai, who was not in particularly good form. It looked like he was on a campaign, making a anti-American campaign speech. Now the former CEO of Alibaba, Jack Ma, and a representative of the Nobel Institute. So it was really kind of a mishmash. And every year, the audience always kind of wants to address Mr. Putin. So everybody will make their remarks, and then all of the questions go to Mr. Putin. So that didn't work very well. They haven't been able to, I think, attract really world-class intellectuals or former leaders that would make it work. So what they did this time, though, and in my view, I don't think it worked, they had Fyodor spend about the first half of the 2.5 hours that he was with, that we were with Mr. Putin, reciting back to Mr. Putin things he'd said over the past 15 years to the Valdai Discussion Club, and asking Mr. Putin what he thought about those now. And it was, it did, at several points during the discussion, Mr. Putin made it clear, you know, look, I'm here to talk to the audience. How long is this discussion with you going to go along? And stuff like that. But Fyodor never, he stuck with his plan. I think that sometimes, you know, when you're in a hole, you need to stop digging and go to plan B. And plan B was right there in front of him, and that was the rest of the audience. But at one point later in the discussion, when Fyodor asked Putin what he wanted to do, Putin responded, I want this conversation to end. I'm flying to Tashkent this evening, and I want to play hockey before I go.
Whoa.
That was... The next day, you know, in Kommersant, sort of Putin's almost personal journalist, Andrei Kolesnikov, wrote a very brutal column about the meeting of the Valdai Club and Putin, titled "Takoy Valdai nam ne нужен." Such a Valdai Club we don't need. And he was really quite pointed about it. And you have to wonder whether someone might have suggested to him. You wonder about the future of the Valdai Club. I think, frankly, when I read that. But if there's another Valdai meeting, I'm very confident that this format is not going to be repeated. Now, I did have an idea actually to lighten the mood of the meeting, to put it in context. 10 years ago, but I knew he'd be in a very bad mood because it was after the Georgia War and the financial, global financial crisis was coming full on. My son had somehow got a hold of a sport card that it was the international world leaders, and it was a Vladimir Putin card. And he said, Dad, he's like 12 years old, Dad, if you can get this card signed, it's going to be worth $200. And I said, William, if I get that card signed, it's going to be worth a lot more than $200. Because no one else in the world is going to have this card signed by Vladimir Putin. Long story short, Putin signed the card. He was very, very gracious about it, and he seemed to really enjoy it. So this year my idea was I'm bringing a Vladimir Alexander Ovechkin jersey, which I spent $200 for to get the top Alexander Ovechkin jersey. And I've gotten tired of trying to ask Mr. Putin questions, because one, if you're going to ask a question, you're always like kind of thinking about it in the session. It kind of interferes with, and he's very hard to catch up. So I just said, Mr. Putin, I have no question. I have a request. I know that you're a big hockey fan, and I know that actually you're very good friends with Mr. Ovechkin. And you know what? Not everybody in Washington hates Russia. You know, in fact, Mr. Ovechkin and the Washington Capitals are incredibly popular. And I know you guys are friends. My son has requested that you sign his jersey, blah, blah, blah. I was not called upon to do that. Although I'd run it by the organizers of the club beforehand, and they were very enthusiastic about it. But I think a couple of things. One, I think the fact that the Kerch tragedy might have changed the equation. I think that Fyodor, I think he was uncomfortable in an awkward situation with the situation. And also, the nature of the club has changed. You know, 10 years ago, it was 40 of us, and there would be cameras running only for the first 10 or 15 minutes. And it was not such a public event. This is very, very different. And frankly, I had mixed feelings about, this is a photo opportunity, that I would be there having Mr. Putin sign an Alexander Ovechkin jersey. I'm a more sort of tough-skinned about those things, and I thought it was kind of funny, and he would sort of enjoy it. But nevertheless, it didn't happen. So regarding the substance and the mood, Putin definitely exuded a kind of a quiet confidence, I felt, on foreign and security policy choices Russia has made in recent years. And while the three-day conference was supposed to more address domestic issues, certainly when he spoke, it almost much more addressed foreign policy and security issues. And what I'm going to say is sort of based on a sort of more of a thought piece that I wrote yesterday for another publication that will come out hopefully the next day or two. So the first questioner was a Chinese journalist, Sheng Xilang. And he's quite a clever guy, and he usually puts his questions in kind of a metaphorical way. And he did that this year, and he raised the forest and the wind metaphor as an old Chinese proverb, comparing Russia and China to trees in the forest, who want calm, but there is a wind that continuously blows to shake and intimidate and cause problems for the trees. Okay, obviously the trees are Russia and China, which, as he said, the United States has defined China and Russia as revisionist states, adversaries. They have unleashed a trade war against the former, China, and endless sanctions against the latter. So Putin agreed that the trees, this is a quote, the trees want to remain quiet, but the wind will not stop. However, the weather is changeable, and the wind will stop blowing at some point. The fact is that those who stir up the wind, they also, so why am I saying that the weather is changeable and it'll stop blowing? The fact is that those who stir up the wind, they also suffer from it. And after noting the figures in the mounting trade war the United States has unleashed on China, Putin concluded, quote, "It'll be one of the reasons for a future recession of the global economy. Everybody will feel it. Nobody wants it to happen. Therefore, it is possible to stir up a wind at some point, but a moment will come when it will not benefit anybody," unquote. So as I was listening to that and then reflecting upon it, I couldn't help to recall, what had happened in 2008, that the United States is supposedly the guarantor or hegemon of the global financial system. We nearly brought on a global depression by the irresponsible greed of our banking and financial mortgage institutions. And this was an extremely unpleasant and unwanted wake-up call for Mr. Putin and the Russian financial institutions that had exposed themselves through large-scale private debt. And at the time, the Russians, they thought they were kind of doing the right thing, in that taking on debt essentially meant that some of their money was going to be dealt with by more responsible institutions than what the Russian institutions were. And that's true in principle, but as it turned out, it kind of blew up in their face. So it was kind of the combination of the big drop in the oil price, but also their greater exposure through private sector debt that led them to being hurt by more than anybody else in the G20 in 2008, 2009. So the wind metaphor may be new, but it's this irresponsible U.S. stewardship of the global system is not a new concept for Vladimir Putin, and it harkens back, of course, maybe first to his speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, which was also about, from his perspective, the irresponsible stewardship of the international system, in that case with respect to security issues. Now, in response to a later question from a Russian economist, Yaroslav Lisovolik, about the potential of de-dollarization of the global economy, there was a fair amount of discussion over the few days about this. In response to Washington's repeated resort to economically sanctioning countries for bad behavior, or from Moscow's perspective, they would define it as they're being punished for implementing policies that run counter to U.S. interests. It's more of a cynical, kind of skeptical perspective on that. But Putin returned to the theme that the United States is in the medium and long term undermining its own global power and influence by doing this to such an extent. And I think his rather colorful reply is worth repeating at some length. As I recently said, our American friends are quarreling with their bread and butter. They challenge the reliability of the dollar as a universal tool for international settlement. Once again, this is a typical mistake for an empire. Now, it's my recollection that this empire, he's not directly referred to the United States as an empire before. But that is certainly, as Angela suggested in her remarks about the report, is that the United States is an empire in decline. And to go on with what he said, why is this happening? Because, and I'm not lashing out at anyone, as I usually do. No, he didn't say that. But an empire always thinks it can make minor mistakes and allow excesses because it might make it all irrelevant. But the number of these excesses and minor mistakes inevitably grows, and the time comes when this cannot be handled either from a security standpoint or from an economic standpoint. Obviously, this is the way our American friends are acting. They are devaluating confidence in the dollar as a universal settlement tool and the world's sole reserve currency. And of course, everybody started to give it more thought. The EU countries want to conduct trade with Iran. They do not think Iran has violated anything in its nuclear deal with the international community, and actually it is not. But our US partners decided that this deal should be revised, but the Europeans disagree with that. So in this case, and there's, I say underlining in the conference and Putin's perspective, in this case in particular, you have the European Union, Russia, China, and Iran, specifically all against the United States. And there was more of a theme I felt kind of underlined the conference and in Putin's remarks about, either it's the United States or the United States and an expanded West versus this greater Eurasia. That is kind of the framework in which Mr. Putin and his colleagues are viewing the world. Now let me talk a bit about Syria and the Middle East. Now, of course, because it's somewhat of a transition in this vein, Mr. Putin could not restrain himself from pointing out that the U.S. and allied policy in Iraq and Libya resulted in much greater instability and increased terrorist threat. His remarks were especially pointed toward Libya. This is not the first time he's done this, and Libya, in general, that state ceased to exist. It is being torn to pieces between separate armed units still fighting among themselves. This is a catastrophe. Gaddafi once said, Libya was an insurmountable obstacle to the movement of refugees and immigrants from Africa to Europe. He said, "What are you doing? You are destroying this wall." Was Putin referring to Gaddafi? So it was destroyed. This is what is happening right now, seeking for a guilty party, but they only have themselves to blame. So Mr. Putin discussed Syria in a very sober way, and when asked by Fyodor whether he believed that the Russian decision to intervene in Syria had been worth it, he definitely replied in the affirmative, and noting that a sovereign state was preserved, and that the Somaliization of Syria was prevented. He praised the efforts of Turkey in particular, stemming from the Russian-Turkish agreement of September 15th to de-escalate the violence in the Idlib region, the last major stronghold of the opposition, and seek to convince fighters to lay down their arms. He acknowledged this is an extremely difficult task, and a Turkish scholar earlier in the Middle East panel, Angela talked about, noted that about 60% of the fighters have disarmed to date. But there remain a myriad of problems ahead with Syria. First, where do the international fighters go? No country wants them. Second, how do you manage the approximately 7 million Syrian refugees living outside of Syria? And that was probably the most striking graphic that Deputy Minister of Defense Foman put up. It was a map at the indication of the numbers of Syrian refugees in each country. 3.5 million in Turkey, 1 million in Lebanon, that's like 1 out of every 4 or 5 Lebanese, 700,000 in Jordan, also a relatively small country, and of course in Europe what stood out was there are about 540,000 Syrian refugees in Germany. But these fighters, nobody's going to want them. Where do the refugees go? And then, third, who pays for and manages the reconstruction of Syria? For the Russians, I think, including Putin, the United States, and here I'm kind of combining what I heard on the Middle East panel and what Putin had to say, has been taking positions that are unconstructive or unrealistic, that are dangerous, and perhaps even immoral. And on the first, I think on the unrealistic, the Trump administration's demand that all Iranian military forces must leave Syria before the United States' much smaller force structure does is nearly impossible to meet. And when asked about the Russian position on the Iranian forces, Putin kind of dodged a bit by noting this will be a decision for the Iranians and the Syrian government. He did note that Russia is working hard to reach a near-term agreement to help keep Iranian forces further from the Golan Heights to help alleviate Israeli concerns about Syria. On the danger, Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and top Russian Middle East expert Vitaly Naumkin all criticized the U.S. military defending a Kurdish stronghold in the south on oil-rich territory where the terrorist threat is not being effectively addressed in their view. And interestingly, to me, it was the moderate and intellectual Naumkin who made the clearest and toughest remark about this, that the Russian position supports the Syrian government controlling 100% of Syrian territory. And, quote, "It is time for the United States to leave. It is time for the United States to leave." 80% of the Syrian territory is now governed by the Syrian government. 20% remains. That's a pretty strong statement. And regarding this, there was a sense, even I was surprised that it was Vitaly. Maybe that was, he was to be the bad cop, perhaps. But almost, the patience of Russia is wearing thin on what the United States is doing in Syria. And of course they're pointing out, and the Russians talk, as Putin would say and others, the Russians and the Iranians and the Turks are working quite closely together. Their interests aren't, fully 100% coincident, but especially for Russia and Turkey, from where they were a few years ago, it's quite apparent. As for the potentially immoral, and this is, I confess this is my view, the recent Trump, but this is something that Putin mentioned and others mentioned in the conference, the Trump administration announcement that the United States will sanction any company that is involved in reconstruction of the Syrian government controlled territory. You know, it's deeply problematic. The Syrian government, it's just a fact, the Syrian government controls most of this territory. So it's one thing not to contribute funds to the reconstruction of Syria, that's one thing. But then to punish others, including many of our allies who would be involved in this, who are interested in being involved in this, you know, that to me is quite something. It kind of leaves the question, you know, okay, you know, our policy in Syria has failed, unfortunately, catastrophically and tragically. And you know, should we further punish the Syrian population for that reality? That's me. That's not Vladimir Putin. But I left Sochi with a similar feeling I had after reading Putin's Munich speech in 2007. I didn't care for the messenger. I don't like the messenger. But a lot of what he's saying about the United States undermining its own interests and power and influence across Eurasia, it's, you know, there's a lot you can agree with. In 2014, we embarked on a policy to isolate Russia, and you know, sitting in that room in Sochi with representatives from all over Eurasia and all over the world, you know, one definitely doesn't have the feeling that Russia is isolated, but in fact that our policies are isolating us to an extent on a number of issues. He talked about Mr. Trump. He had an interesting remark about that, nukes, Ukraine, and maybe I'll stop and we can, you know, address what you want to discuss in discussion.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, he did say that President Trump listens to him, that they have normal conversations, and so again, it was the implication that it's the people around President Trump are not letting him do what he wants to do.
But it was really a backhanded compliment. You know, Mr. Trump is not a tetier. He's like not a dodo bird, or it was translated as a wood grouse.
A wood grouse, right?
You know.
Okay, so we've put quite a lot out there on the table. If people have questions, comments.
If anybody cares, here's the program. If you want to look through it,
Yeah.
I do want to get it back because I want
Right,
my
okay,
notes.
Anna Sasland, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting. What most strikes me is that he seems to be completely detached from Russian political and economic reality. That it's talk about foreign policy rather than Russia. But my question is Ukraine. Did they say anything of any relevance about the war in Ukraine rather than about the Orthodox Church?
No, nothing. I mean, I think President Putin did say we have to await, nothing's going to happen in Ukraine until after the election. But he said nothing about the war or nobody said anything
Well,
about
there was a question
Yeah.
from Misha Pogorodinsky about Ukraine.
Right.
So, I had to ask you about this. Putin said his typical spiel. That we have a Minsk agreement. The Ukrainian government is not abiding by the Minsk agreement.
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be elections in Ukraine in this next year, and that's about it. It might have been, was it maybe perhaps Foreign Minister Lavrov that said, you know, they expect this to be a lost year, 2019.
Yeah, lost.
As far as any negotiations
Which makes
go.
sense.
But there's
Yeah.
no change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Voice of America, Russian Service. Can I ask you a question which a little bit off all that? You just said, and I spoke with other participants, other experts, that Putin was extremely confident. He was 2.5 hours, relaxed. Even his jokes, which made some people nervous, were okay for him. And yesterday with Bolton, he was extremely nervous. I watched 10 minutes of his protocol before it talks itself. And he was looking over all area, not at him and so on. He was extremely nervous. What makes him nervous? What can be what the signal that Bolton brought from Washington, apart from INF Treaty, that makes him really nervous. And also, if you can think of it, what was the essence of this visit?
You want to take a first cut, Angela? You could.
No, you can start.
I don't think they expected we were going to withdraw at this time from the INF Treaty.
That actually never came up that was interesting.
Lavrov mentioned it, but it was just sort of like, yeah, you know, we have these claims, they have these claims.
Right.
So I think the timing of it caught them off guard. And the implication thereof is that the United States is prepared to engage in a nuclear arms race with Russia, China, or whoever else is gonna come on. I think that doesn't make the Russians very comfortable. Although from a strategic standpoint, I think the Russians have more to benefit from the demise of the INF Treaty, because they're in the position where they face a lot of countries with medium-range missiles around them, and which they would like to probably have more of a free hand to deter. And also, I think from our standpoint, I think the withdrawal from the INF Treaty has more to do with China than it has to do with Russia. Maybe that makes Putin nervous, so that the Russians are always nervous about getting kind of caught up in having to make a decision between the United States and China. But I don't know, what do you think?
I think you're right. I mean, so when he spoke at Valdai, not only was he self-confident, he was bored. And I mean, for instance, we have, this Japanese colleague who every year asks the same question about the islands. And so when he had his hand up and Lukyanov called on him, Putin already said, oh, don't ask me about the islands. I'm bored with this. And so he did ask the question. He got he got the answer, I think, that he maybe didn't want. So I think when you look at the way he performed at Valdai, it's a mixture of, yes, he's relaxed, but also, and as Andy said, saying, I'd like to go and play hockey. He didn't give you the impression that he was desperately happy that he was there. And I think with Bolton, so he spoke to us the day before the United States, I think it was President Trump first said, we're going to withdraw from the INF Treaty. I'm not sure that they expected it. And when I was in Moscow the weekend before, it was a US-Russia conference, and they talked about Bolton's upcoming visit. I'm not sure that any of those people thought that this was going to be the major item there. I don't know how much they knew about that. So, but I think so, because I think he realizes that the US, we are now engaging in a bigger arms buildup, and even though we probably can't deploy any new systems on land, we're not going to go through another 1982 Pershing debate with the Germans, but we can deploy things by sea and things like that. So I think for Russia, that could be a new challenge. It will require more expenditures from them. And I agree with Andy that objectively, from a Russian point of view, the INF Treaty maybe didn't serve their interests in terms of their neighbors, including the big neighbor whose name you can't ever criticize, but China.
Just to follow up a little bit, I think they must have buyer's regret. About thinking that a Donald Trump administration would be a better thing for Russian interests.
They still haven't yet.
Well, no, I think they're not coming to the realization now that they are actually facing a much more traditional, very hard line Republican nationalist administration that is unpredictable. They make everybody nervous, I think, because it's unexpected as to what they will do. And we don't know what else Mr. Bolton said to Mr. Putin. One thought I had was, well, okay, if we withdraw from the INF, and I'm okay with that because the strategic situation has changed dramatically in 31 years. Well, that might actually make it easier to extend the New START treaty, because the New START treaty would never be able to be extended if there was still an outstanding dispute about the INF treaty. But I didn't hear anything.
Well, also, we do have a national security advisor who does not like arms control treaties.
Yes.
And when he was in office,
Yep.
we signed a, 3-page Moscow treaty,
Yep.
the so-called sword agreement with the Russians.
Yeah,
which
so I
they
wouldn't
really
hold- I
didn't
wouldn't- I
want.
wouldn't hold my
I wouldn't-
breath on
I wouldn't
that.
hold your breath about
That
that.
silver lining.
Yes.
Angela, you mentioned the North Korea aspect of this,
Yeah.
positive comments. Was there any sort of forward discussion or anything that elaborated on that at all in terms of the Russian roles or anything of that sort?
Not really about the Russian role. I think it was more that, it's better that, the US is talking to the North Koreans. I don't recall that there was anything much that was said about the Russian role, because it's not clear really what the Russian role is in all of this. But this was one of the areas where the US was not criticized. But that was it.
Just
Yeah.
to follow up, there was so
Yeah.
much more discussion really about Syria. And Mr. Putin's first comment about Syria was, first of all, it's much better for Russia to be fighting the terrorists in Syria rather than on our own territory, which, as you know, was the case X amount of years ago.
Yes.
So I have a more conceptual question for both of you, and I've heard you give these updates on several occasions, but this is the first time that this occurred to me to ask how you read the messages there, and it was prompted by what both of you were saying about you get the impression of a kind of Russian view of the world, which is, the world order is collapsing, the US is on the way down. It's a fairly rosy picture and on this Eurasianist type outlook. How do you gauge what is on presentation for influential foreigners, and how do you read what sort of you can actually glean from shifts in Russian thinking?
Wow, yes, it's a good question. I mean, firstly, the message has been over the years and again this year, don't underestimate Russia's power and influence globally. To go back to something that Anders said, de-emphasizing what was happening domestically. Somebody did ask Putin, right, about the fact that his popularity rating had fallen by 20%. And then he sort of brushed it off and said, well, we don't really, we don't follow these things, which is contrary to most of what that is.
He had a decent answer. He said, look, we undertook pension reform. Pension reform is unpopular in any country.
Right, yeah.
Especially when you promise not to do it.
Right, but I have to mention one thing. This is the proverbial taxi driver, but I've had the same person who's picked me up from the airport and driven me to hotels in Moscow for 10 years, and he picked me up this time, and he has never been critical of the government. Boy, did I get an earful about pension reform, about the lack of money for people, saying our government has all this money, we're earning all this money from oil, what are they doing with it? But that 20% fall, and the previous conference I was at, the previous weekend, we did have Yev Gudkov from the Levada Center there. And it's very interesting, if you look at the data that he presented, more and more Russians are now saying, we're not so obsessed with stability anymore, we really would like some change. So, I mean, that is something, that's down there. Anyway, to get back to the impression of Valdai. So I think it's taking Russia seriously and essentially saying, which some of them did, you didn't listen to us. I mean, Putin has said that on numerous occasions, but others did too. And this is what happens when you don't listen to us, and we are a rising power. We have a different view of the world. This is where the conservative values come in. And it's not, the US can't go forward and think that it can essentially dictate the way that the system is run. Without any specifics about what they think this new world order should look like. I don't know how you would respond to Michael's question.
Well, I think they are presenting, especially on this kind of economic sanctions and trade positions that we're taking, is that we are, that we're kind of accelerating the mobilization of the time in which the U.S. dollar, will not occupy the hegemonic position as it does in the global financial system, and is that something in your interest? And even Putin talked at some length about various mechanisms that countries are starting to take, which they never would have started to think about doing in particular if it hadn't been with Ukraine. And I think they feel a greater deal of solidarity on this. And it was striking just to see the news on Monday where Xi Jinping and Mr. Abe are getting together and talking about that they need to work more together to take measures to address some of the measures that the United States is taking, and that China is considering more the TPP, ironically. And so I think that what he's seeing is that there's this boomerang effect. And he's been noting over the course of, at least 15 years, I suppose, go back to the Iraq War, but that it has accelerated significantly in his mind. Now, on the I couldn't help but to rain on their parade. It was the foreign policy panel where they were really going off, and I had this very strange panel on Eurasia, which didn't make any sense at all, except was the Anders, our friend Yevgeny Gavrilenkov spoke on the panel. Way too long, but he basically made a point. The United States has two big advantages. One is currency. That may be, you can argue about to what extent that's eroding. And the other one is high-tech innovation. And my point of making that panel was like, look, China and Russia, I mean, what you are doing with your domestic political economic system is discouraging high-tech and innovation. And it's going to hurt you in the long run.
Yeah, I think one other thing to get back to your question, so I didn't actually discuss the panel on Eurasia because I didn't really understand. It was very hard to know what they were really talking about, apart from a former Mongolian foreign minister who said the definition of a real Eurasian is someone who can live comfortably in a temperature of minus 40 degrees.
There's a more limited geographic definition.
But I think that and the interesting thing is the message there is that there is this new Eurasian concept coming, and yet there are very few Central Asian participants ever come to this, right? Which in itself is interesting. Anyway, that was part of it.
What about the Eurasian economic?
Well, so we had the Armenian, I guess it's either Secretary General or what's his title?
He's the head of it.
The head of it. And he gave, what I thought was a rather general but upbeat speech. And I will, about all the agreements the Eurasian Economic Union is signing with different countries and how things are going better. And I would just say, so one of the people who works for him is someone who was a postdoctoral fellow at our center a few years ago. And I had dinner with him afterwards, and he said, we sign all these agreements with all these countries and nothing happens. So I got a rather different message from the person whom I talked to about this in the formal presentation. But you said you saw some interesting things there.
Well, what he said in public that struck me is that, one, there is no interest right now in expanding the membership of the organization.
Right. Yeah.
Not at all. Two, there is no significant interest right now in expanding the relationship between the Eurasian Economic Union and China.
Right.
Now that was definitely new, in that there, in 2015, when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin signing on the behalf of all the other members of the Eurasian Economic Union, with or without their approval, the agreement that the Silk Road Economic Belt would cooperate with the Eurasian Economic Union. For the last 2 or 3 years, the Russians have been trumpeting this, and even there was some trumpeting of it, as part of the Sino-Russian rapprochement, or quasi alliance. So it was striking to me that he said, look, we're not doing this at all. It's like, oh, okay, well that's actually pretty realistic, because I didn't see how it was going to work anyway. But
Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was interested in this notion that Russia is going to pull out of all these international organizations in which they feel really bashed. It seems like Russia's had so many occasions on which, for instance, they could have pulled out of the European Council of Europe because they're tired of having these massive judgments against them in the European Court of Human Rights and so forth. Do you think that's still talk, or is there maybe more obsession with the idea that Russia is being treated unfairly, being bashed? Because I saw a poll this morning
Yeah.
it said something like only 3% of Russians believe that the Skripal case.
Yeah,
was
I
a
know,
Russian
isn't that
case.
amazing?
I mean, that sort of senses
Right.
that they may say it, but they're sort of immune to outside criticism
3% of Russians
Yeah,
only
3%.
believe that the Russian special services were involved in the
after
Skripal
seeing
case.
the tourists on TV and they're
Right.
unconvincing.
So, and a large number think it was the British Secret Services. So, with the Council of Europe, right, this has gone on now for 20 whatever years, and they get the judgments against them, they get suspended, but they never pull out because it's always been part of what Russia wanted since the early 90s, which is to be part of these institutions that confers a certain amount of legitimacy on Russia. So the only reason why they really would pull out is if at some point the calculus has changed and they don't feel that they need that legitimacy anymore. And I'm not, you never know when you go to a panel like that and Nikonov says this, is this just his own view or is he telegraphing something that comes from higher up? So I don't know the answer to that. So far they've never done it, but I mean they might. On the OSCE, I mean, that's something where, of course, the Russians criticize the OSCE, and they have for a long time because of the ODIHR, because of the Office of Democratic, and Human Rights and the election monitoring. But again, it would be, quite notable if Russia really sought to withdraw from the OSCE since they're one of the founding members. But this idea that Russia shouldn't be a member of any Russia-bashing organization, again, I don't know whether Karaganov was speaking for himself or conveying something else. I don't know what your sense is.
Well, I agree with everything Angela said. I would just add that I think that Moscow is still has an idea that it can kind of engage in Europe and split Europe from the United States. The things the United States is doing is actually helping that along. So perhaps why stir the pot up by leaving these organizations that you don't really care about anyway.
I think someone at the back? Yes, Christian.
Yeah, so on the same topic of international organizations, I have a question about the UN. You mentioned in the beginning that there was some kind of discussion on the role of the United Nations in Valdai, and we know that Russia generally has a very favorable view of the United Nations due to its own privileged status of a permanent member of the Security Council. So I'm just curious, why were people at Valdai skeptical about the UN?
So I was very surprised reading that paper where it said the United Nations isn't going to be helpful anymore and it's not an adequate organization to create a new world order, because that's not what you normally hear from the Russians. For them, the UN is a great organization because by virtue of their veto power on the Security Council, they have more influence than maybe their resources would justify. So, but that was not the view of other people in the conference. I don't know. And I think one of the people who was on the panel discussing the report, or later on, said that they disagreed with that conclusion. So I don't think we heard that from anyone else.
No, not really. I think there's an acknowledgement that the UN is stymied again, like it was in the Cold War.
Yeah.
And that maybe there may be some debate within Russia. There are some that may be more confident that in the longer run that there'll be more countries, larger countries, influential countries that will kind of be more on the side of Russia.
Yeah.
I think there is this sort of sense that this is the way that Eurasia is moving.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you.
Well,
Oh, we do
Lily's
have a
back.
question. All right. Yeah.
Just a quick
Lily has come back.
question regarding whether you got any sense of the future for President Putin. Maria Snigovaya recently at a panel suggested that there's a lot of buzz, at least in Moscow, about some Belarus situation, about potentially this concept of uniting Belarus and Russia and appointing him as the leader at the top. And I was wondering whether you heard anything of the sort.
Who? About uniting who?
Uniting
Belarus.
Belarus
Oh,
and
Belarus
Russia.
and Russia,
Yeah,
sorry.
and giving Mr. Putin a role as the leader at the top. I mean, yes, it sounds a little far-fetched, but
Mhm.
have you heard anything of the sorts about Belarus?
I haven't. I don't know whether you have.
Not recently, no. There's always been this idea floated out there since they created the Russia-Belarus Union.
Well,
back in
Lukashenko wanted to be
1996.
president
Yeah.
in 2000,
Right.
but that didn't work out so well.
Right.
So.
I haven't heard anything along those lines.
Yeah.
Lily?
Just a question about sort of the nature of Valdai itself. I'm interested in the dynamic between sort of Russian heads of state and foreign experts, and Russian experts seem sort of absent from the conversation. Do you think that they ought to play more of a role in Valdai, that their point of view is missing, or that the point of Valdai is specifically to project Russian views of itself to the outside?
Well, so in the first years, that was explicitly the goal of Valdai, it was for foreigners. And they did invite Russians, but the Russians were never there at the dinners with Putin. So the only people who were there at the dinners with Putin were foreigners. That's changed, and they have more Russian experts there, and then when Putin appears, the Russians are there too. So I think that I think that the nature of what Valdai stands for has somewhat altered because of that. I mean, Russians play a much bigger role now than they used to.
Much bigger. And that was
Yeah.
really a big message, I think, from this meeting.
Yeah.
You look at the program, and you can also look at like who was called upon to ask questions, and the great majority are Russian. So that has really changed.
Yeah, that's really changed, and it's not, I mean, it's not clear why, but but it definitely has. And so what it really is an opportunity, right, for Russian officials and experts to present views to a foreign audience and to a Russian audience, or to present a message, and then you understand what the message is. And so I suppose the most interesting part of it just is to understand what is the message that they're trying to convey and how has it changed. But I should also say, I mean, they've never had, the Western heads of state who've sat on the stage, for instance, with President Putin, have all been ex-chancellors, presidents, things like that, and they've never had an American official. I mean, they did have Rick Byrd, who's an ex-American official, but they've tried to get Americans to come officials, but they never succeeded, so.
You know, Cliff Getty and Fiona Hill, I thought, wrote pretty insightfully in their biography about Putin, that, and I think this may come more from Cliff, that for Mr. Putin, what he sees as valuable from this as an intelligence officer, as it's an opportunity for him to interact with a lot of foreigners and to hear what they're thinking about, and that's useful for him. It's like a focus group, if you will. Think of the Valdai Club as a focus group, and I think perhaps that might. And so the format they had this year in particular, where
Yeah.
Look, I didn't come here to answer questions from a Russian, and especially questions about what I had said about 3, 5, 8, 10 years ago about something that might have contributed to why that this wasn't useful for him.
It's true. Yeah.
What did you feel when Putin at Valdai was talking like Shahids or Jihadists, when he was saying about going to the paradise after the nuclear war between US or West?
Yeah.
What do you think about international security?
That was a
When-
very strange
It was
statement.
that was
Yeah.
to me that was sardonic Vladimir Putin, and he kind of put it in this metaphorical way. But what he was basically explaining is that Russia has a no first strike nuclear policy, and unless they are getting demolished in a conventional war, but they have a no first strikes. There's nothing new about what he said. And the way deterrence works, this is it. It's like it's the dead hand that David Hoffman wrote about so brilliantly in his book. If we detect a launch against us, we're going to press the buttons on the launch against them, and we're going to go to heaven because we were the good guys that got launched upon, and they're nothing. That's how I took
But we're
it.
still all dead.
We're all
We're all dead. Some of us will go to heaven and some of us won't.
I mean, some people really took issue with it, but I don't know. We've been meeting him so often, we kind of get accustomed to his rather acid with sort of sardonic nature.
What Russian part of Facebook was all about it.
Well, there was the poem that was written by the musician almost right after.
Yeah.
It was quite brilliant.
Schneider.
Schneider, right. It's very clever. I recommend it.
There were a lot of jokes about it.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all for coming. We'll see if there'll be one next